Worship God at church on Sunday. That was the message given to children at the church of which I was a pastor, through the wonderful medium of line drawings with Sharpie on bright lime green walls. In its attempt to paraphrase the Sabbath command of the Decalogue for children, an entire world of false, supersessionist belief is opened to us. We, of course, all know that the Sabbath isn't about Sunday, it's not about a church building, and it's not even about worship, at least in the sense implied by the act of going to church. The Sabbath is a wonderfully rich concept of divine and kingly rest that runs through the biblical narrative, and, according to the purpose of Hebrews, is the purpose or end of God's people. I painted over these line drawings and got into some trouble for it. I was hardly part of a Reformation mob smashing statues and stained glass, but herein lies the heart of a bad biblical theology, one that has been ingrained in our collective Christian consciousnesses for generations. Worship God at church on Sunday. Or perhaps we could put it in the language of the Westminster Shorter Catechism. The chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. Herein lies the view of Christian faith as temple-centric. Sacred times must be marked by sacred worship in sacred locations, and the whole world ought to behave in the same way. But what if the Sabbath command and the rest of Scripture wasn't about worship, in the sense we think of it, but about a missional eschatology that resulted finally in worship? That would bring about a sea change in theology and mission. In this presentation, we will look briefly at the notion of a cosmic temple in the Garden of Eden, and see why I believe it is better understood as a portrayal of a cosmic palace, and what this means for a biblical theology. Certainly this is no easy feat, as it goes against widely received scholarship. My reasons do not come directly from textual comparisons, but from a variety of other fields: theology, anthropology, comparative religion, and the classics, as well as a narrative thrust in Scripture. It must be noted that this is not an attack on all temple theology, but an attempt at placing the temple within a more nuanced and theologically coherent place in a biblical theology. For this, we look at revelation and religion. These fields are often neglected by Christian theology, and often for good reasons. Certainly, I believe the Bible is the sole source of divine revelation, authoritatively at least. However, that does not mean that there is nothing to learn about as people are ever formed into idolatry in ever subtler forms. One simple remark is needed in this field. Do we believe that Judaism and Christianity are superior examples of a type of thing called religion? Or do we believe that Christian faith is something entirely distinct to religion and deeply critical of it, at least as presented by Jesus in the New Testament? Now, I fully subscribe to the latter view and would love to reform your view if you subscribe to the former. I'm fully aware that religion was embedded in ancient society and that it's a very slippery term. I argued in my PhD and elsewhere following Jacques Ellul that the sacred is a more important phenomenon than religion to discuss, and that it permeates our world in embedded ways, just as powerfully today. I'm also aware that there's a lot of ambiguity between these two architectural features, the temple and the palace, just as there is between priest and king in the early Bronze Age. But I think Karl Barth's basic framework for understanding religion is helpful in any society. Religion ascends to God. Revelation is God's descent to us. Religion is a human creation. Revelation is a divine unveiling through contextualized forms. So let's look at some differences between the palace and the temple. There's quite a bit of ambiguity between them, as one is modeled after another, just as many kings were also priests. It's important to understand that both palace and temple developed in human history. They are not eternal archetypes. nor is Israel or the Bible the first place we learn about either. While ancient politics and religion developed organically and were thoroughly embedded, that does not mean that they endured in some static way. Ancient religious belief and practice changed dramatically, just as its social and state structures do. Although large ancient Near Eastern cities seem to develop around their massive temple complexes, this does not represent the history of Israel as it is presented in the Bible, nor is this universally true. The way people construct temples tells us a lot about the people. The Greek polis, for example, did not develop around a large temple complex. Their temples, with a few exceptions, remained small. Greek temples were much more democratic, as was their polis and their agora. Their temples were not the center of the cosmos, except perhaps for Delphi. This means that we need to pay greater attention to the narrative of the Bible and use comparative evidence as an aid in understanding meanings and symbolism. In the Bible's narrative, the house of God is used of a variety of things, one of which is simply a rock in Genesis chapter 28. If the Bible is unashamed of the development of religious practice and definition of house of God, then we should not begin with a predetermined understanding. Now, a palace is the house of a king. It is the center of a city, kingdom, or empire. It is what makes a capital or head city. Often it was, as it is with modern palaces like Buckingham Palace, surrounded by a garden. This garden would symbolize the cultivating and civilizing power of the king, and the cosmic peace that his rule engendered. It would also be a lovely place to walk in the cool of the day, and to hold counsel with trusted advisors in the peace that would exist behind high palace walls guarded by elite soldiers. A palace is built by the king, through workers, for the king, to represent the king to the kingdom. As the king's house, he had to depart and do much business. The Pharaoh of Egypt, for example, traveled the length of the country, often in Nile barges. The big house of a king is an earlier phenomenon than a temple, as will be shown shortly. The palace offers immediate access to the king for all who are permitted to enter, or when the king goes out. The temple is, by contrast, built by people for a god who is then invited in, kind of. Many ancient people knew that gods didn't really live in buildings. Greeks believed that the gods visited their temples. In some Greek cult, worshippers often prayed facing away from the statue or image of the god, with hands lifted up to the sky or down to the earth, depending on which god they were praying to, Olympian or chthonic. There is also pottery depicting a priest offering sacrifice to a statue, with the actual god watching over the whole thing. So the temple can be somewhat ambiguous in terms of the god's actual residence therein. Shrines are built around naturally occurring sacred spaces like springs or groves, and do not usually have permanent priesthoods. The temple is a later construction. Some societies never really built temples because they never personified forces beyond that of spirits, as in Shintoism, which only has shrines, but nevertheless had a powerful imperial regime. So how do we know the temple is secondary to the palace? The temple in the Bible is the house of God, as it is in many cultures. If the temple came first, palaces would be understood as temples of kings. Hechal, as used in the Hebrew Bible, is a word found also in Canaanite, from Akkadian ekalu, and from Sumerian egal, meaning big house or palace. Also in the biblical narrative, the palace of David comes before the Temple of Solomon. The temple is also a place to come to where the presence of a god is protected by the mediating ministry of a professional priesthood who would know and pass on all the special rules for maintaining the sacred cleanness of the god's dwelling and image. The temple, as we know, was a microcosm, Specifically in the ancient Near East, as their fewer but larger temple complexes represented larger gods with significantly more power than the incredible variety of smaller deities in Greek religion, for example. The Greeks only had a few pan-Hellenic sacred sites with large priesthoods at Delphi and Delos. Many were local deities who represented the polis rather than the whole cosmos. The temple, as generally a later occurrence than royal residences, suggests that temples conceptually sacralized a pre-existing order. Temples also were permanent and mostly unchanging structures with routine rituals. The Egyptian priesthood's job, for example, was to keep the very complicated calendar and anticipate the annual flooding of the Nile. It was the institution which sustained the order of the cosmos through ritual participation with vital yearly events in the cycle, often celebrating the end of space and time with the end of the year and participating in its recreation through New Year's festivals. The ancient Near Eastern temple staves off the victory of chaos by regularly re-establishing order out of chaos. Now there's much else we could say about these differences, but we'll leave it there and move on to talk about biblical theology and the temple and palace. G.K. Beale's The Temple and the Church's Mission is a classic text in advancing a biblical theology of the temple. Many others exist as well. Beale argues that Eden is the cosmic temple, an archetype of all temples, though this archetype is lost. It had a proper cult and worship. God's people, the remnant, are the only ones who get the temple right. He argues that Revelation is progressive, and so it moves from temples to Jesus. The mission of a temple is territory expansion, and in Jesus the temple becomes God's people, who are to expand the temple to encompass all of creation, so that God's dwelling place becomes the whole creation. Now, this is a compelling argument, and one for which I have some sympathy. In making this argument, Beale firmly believes that Christianity through Judaism represents the correct religion. Essentially, Beale argues that people are created for worship, and this goes wrong in the fall, and the mission of God's people is to spread this worship globally, to recover the original purpose of humanity, so that it can thrive. Admirable as this argument is, I think it has a few serious errors that means it misses the mark in important ways. Firstly, it has interpretive and methodological issues. What do we believe about the revelation of God in Scripture? If we work from a canonical method, we must begin with Genesis and not with the temple or tabernacle, for this is how the Bible presents itself. Now, this does not mean the temple could not have been in sight in Genesis 1 through 3. But it does mean that it's difficult to understand the logic Beale and others use in creating a synchronic idea of a temple out of a diachronic story of development. I think they're guilty of essentializing the temple. For example, using Ezekiel to understand Eden is suspect. Surely Ezekiel alludes to Edenic imagery, and why could we not also think that the temple itself alludes to Edenic imagery, rather than assuming Eden is a historical retrojection of an existing temple? Beale's weakest point is in his use of the temple as an ontologically real archetype, or at least a category in the mind of God. The development of human and religious political history suggests that temples develop out of projecting divine dwellings in houses modeled on human royal dwellings, and in tents where people live in tents. This fits the biblical narrative as delivered quite well. This explains why the Temple of Solomon fits so well other ancient Near Eastern patterns. It was modeled on long pre-existing ancient Near Eastern architecture. Ancient Near Eastern temple architecture is not a poor imitation of divinely ordained temple architecture. To think otherwise requires a strange and obstinate faith commitment. After all, Hiram of Tyre is consulted to build David's palace, Solomon's palace, and the temple. There are theological and philosophical reasons for critique here. Temples are a solution to a problem. They provide mediation and confirm the right ordering of the cosmos, however conceived by a people in their time. Mediation is only necessary where there is estrangement. Georges Bataille's short but powerful theory of religion argues that religion arises out of a loss of human intimacy with nature. Religion represents a situation of alienation or estrangement, but structures of permanent mediation like temples do not bring lasting reconciliation by definition. Instead, they perpetuate estrangement. Yet the biblical narrative continually points toward reconciliation, historically progressive as it is. Thus, the correct ongoing cult doesn't interest God so much as lasting reconciliation with Him. Psalm 51 tells us this, as does Isaiah 1. Jesus says this to the Samaritan woman who asks about the right worship centers. Thus, I am deeply skeptical that God would create the temple as Beale suggests He does. Temples, like other religious phenomena, are human creations designed to meet fallen human needs. God's creation was not a chaos kampf. It is not regularly threatened by chaos. I often argue that God is most often the author of chaos in the Hebrew Bible. And the blood of goats and bulls cannot reconcile people to God, let alone reconciling people to bulls and goats. Temples are houses built by human hands that a god is invited into. A king builds his own palace, as Samuel Kings shows very well. God created the heavens and the earth and Eden. That is, He created His own palace. We know that God does not live in houses built by human hands. Temples exist for worship, which rightly orders and therefore preserves or sustains the cosmos, or at least our sense of stability. On the other hand, palaces exist to manage a kingdom. People come to the temple to meet a god, whereas the palace is the place from which a king goes out to meet the people. In this way, temples are attractional, palaces are missional, if I can use contemporary missional jargon. Textual reasons for this critique. One example of a textual reason to be suspicious of the cosmic temple is within Genesis itself. The silences of Genesis 1-3 speak very loudly, as many scholars have noted, like Gordon Wenham. It is significant that it does not mention that God created the sun or the moon, but the greater and lesser lights, in order to avoid the idea that God created Shamesh or Yareach. I'm always struck by the fact that for the opening of the greatest religious work in human history, there is no mention of normal religious features in the creation. There's no sacrifice, no prayer, no priesthood, no vestments, and no liturgical service. Cain and Abel perform the first sacrifice in the Bible, which results in jealousy and fratricide. We aren't told why God rejects Cain's sacrifice. Perhaps the better question is why He accepted Abel's. Furthermore, Genesis specifically states that prayer begins with Seth's son in chapter 4, verse 26. Let me suggest that Genesis understands something that its pagan context was unable to imagine, that religion exists because God is absent. Religion, if I can be forgiven for using this word here, is the estranged condition in which people construct order out of chaos in ways that make contextual sense to them. But humans have no participation in the Genesis creation, and it is completed. That means that the cosmos, or at least the polis for the Greeks, cannot be ritually or ceremonially reenacted, thus guaranteed on a yearly basis, as seems to happen throughout religions in the ancient world. It seems rather strange to me, then, to suggest that Genesis is portraying Eden as a cosmic temple, when Genesis clearly understands that God does not institute sacrifices, prayers, or priesthoods, but that people do. Genesis 1-3 lacks essential features of all human temples across geography, time, and culture. These glaring omissions, to my mind, speak louder than the obvious similarities that exists between palaces and temples. If Eden actually had some historic existence, it would seem that temples are human attempts to recreate this intimate situation. Thus, temples and their garden imagery, less commonly actual gardens or orchards, are using classic magical imaginative thinking, that by control of the symbol or microcosm, the macrocosm or symbolic referent can be controlled. To that point, neither the Temple of Solomon nor the Second Temple had extensive gardens. There are etymological reasons for this critique. Jesus says to the thief hanged next to him, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Paradise seems to be a Persian loanword referring to palace gardens, walled-off hunting grounds or pleasure gardens used in the Septuagint in Genesis chapter 2, verse 8 of Eden. This suggests that there are reasons to assume Second Temple Judaism understood Eden in terms of Persian noble practices. The palace gardens imply an ordered existence under a benevolent and fruitful king who, in this case, is Jesus himself, who is the source of life, the tree of life, as well as the rock that was broken in the wilderness that sprang forth water. There are many other reasons we could cover, but these few are a great place to start reinterpreting the story of the Bible. So we move toward a palatial biblical theology. As we begin to retell the story of the Bible from a palatial perspective, we see that Adam and Eve are created in the image of God. That is, they are given a royal charter, a vocation, to represent God as vicegerents. I have elsewhere argued firmly for this non-ontological conception, as have many other Old Testament scholars. They are to represent God's authority and carry it beyond Eden. Eden, of course, is larger than the garden itself, as we know from the double exile, once of Adam and Eve from the garden and once of Cain from Eden to Nod. Eden is best understood as the name of a palace with gardens and a kingdom, very much in contrast to Enoch, the city that Cain builds. God visits his gardens from the throne room in the cool of the day to walk and hold conference with his vicegerents. When they disobey and break trust, they are exiled. Rather than representing God, they have chosen to become rebels and represent themselves. Acting as rivals, they cannot remain in God's kingdom, though they do until Cain's further exile. In Cain, an entirely rival empire is established, ruled by the prince of this world. Human rebellion is not conceived of as wrong worship in early Genesis, but as violence against God's creation in opposition to the rightful dominion of Genesis 1:28. False religion or idolatry only becomes a central concern of the Bible after God has made a covenant with Moses and the people of Israel at Sinai, and then it is still understood as a broken covenant. Hosea and the marriage covenant metaphor would not have been written or have made sense in Roman or Babylonian religions, for example, where right cult is far more important than the disposition of the heart. Religion in the Bible develops just as archaeology and paleontology suggest that it does in human history. God does not demand that Abraham offer right worship in order to keep covenant. Instead, he requires faithfulness or loyalty. The patriarchs continue in their pagan practices, worshiping Yahweh through these practices. The temple is yet another example of this. It is not the beginning and the end of the story, but a midpoint which must be surpassed as God works to transform human spiritual ambition into heartfelt and transformed obedience. God will build his house in his people rather than eternally dwelling in the house that they make for him. Just as God accommodated to Abraham in making a covenant, so he did with Moses, David, and Solomon. Recall that the desire for a king is a rejection of God in 1 Samuel. But the foundation of a priesthood in Aaron is not a rejection as such. This is because God is the direct king, not in a kind of theocracy mediated by a professional priesthood or divine kingship. The book of Judges presents us with a picture of what ought to be the direct rule going wrong, so that God raises up political spiritual leaders or mediators. The desire for a king is a rejection of God because it introduces mediation in the area that God really cares about. The mission of the people of God is thus not presented as the spread of right cult or right worship. It is the spread of kingdom authority, with the cultic aspects reorientated to Yahweh worship. When we come to Jesus, we find that his self-described mission is to tear down the temple. John introduces Jesus' public ministry in just this way. We find that Jesus is not of a priestly family, but of the royal line. He is killed, as Tom Wright helpfully shows, not on the Day of Atonement, but on the Passover. It's an act of political liberation rather than an act of temple worship. Jesus fulfills what the temple was designed to do, to mediate reconciliation. And thus he abolishes it as a physical structure with continuing worship. Jesus is redeeming Israel's mission and those faithful to the faithfulness of Abraham. He is not redeeming the very things that had become impediment. He is not redeeming the very things that had become impediments to it, its human religion and national identity. Jesus' followers become his body, his dwelling place. This is a unification of the priestly and kingly role. But once there is reconciliation with the king and with the whole creation, the meaning of the temple breaks down and it becomes unnecessary. Thus, believers are perhaps better understood as ambassadors of Christ, and the church as an embassy. God making his appeal through them to all the world to be reconciled to God by submission to Jesus, the chosen King, Messiah. At times this may involve priestly service to those outside of the kingdom, but its end is in the sublation of priesthood. And when we get to the book of Revelation, we see that the fullness of the kingdom involves no temple whatsoever and no priests. Revelation, along with the book of Hebrews, makes it obvious that God does not wait for an invitation to come into houses built by human hands. Instead, God is building a new palace for himself, a heavenly Jerusalem where there is no temple, no mediation. The king stands at our door and knocks, according to Revelation, coming to those who were not expecting a royal visitation. Edenic gardens are there too, in the heavenly Jerusalem, around the palace. And there at the throne room, and there at the throne are God's people. Now they are worshipping him as crowned kings themselves, not because it is right to worship, nor because worship is what they were made for, nor because a narcissistic deity demands it, but because God has redeemed them, reconciled them, matured them, elevated them, and included them in his mission. So they offer thanksgiving. Adam and Eve were simple, and through exile after exile, God's people learned the vital lesson of what being the image of God means. It is not naked innocence, but maturity learned by experience of discipline, tempered with the very compassion that God himself showed in Jesus. The story of the Bible in a nutshell is God preparing a people to rule with him according to his character, or as Paul says, God's predestination is to be conformed to the image of Jesus, who is the exact image of God, the Messiah or chosen King. The mission of the church, then, is not primarily to worship God or offer correct cult, but to represent God. It's not to spread the temple and its right worship, but to spread a kingdom authority as ambassadors making followers, a thoroughly pedagogical idea. The mission of God, then, is deeply political. Its religious expressions will model, though importantly modify, the religious expressions of its historical contexts. The kingdom of God educates the religion out of people, to follow a Bonhoefferian idea. The implications of this, as you can begin to imagine, are vast. To list just a few. Firstly, mission leads to worship in forms appropriate to the culture of a people, that is, in the cultural vernacular. Secondly, the church institution is not a replacement for the temple. It is an embassy of the kingdom. Thirdly, the church does not exist to legitimize the state, as temples have always done, but to be the presence of God's kingdom in always foreign lands. Fourthly, the priesthood of all believers should be reinterpreted as missional ambassadorial enterprise, not to replace the spiritual, but to integrate the spiritual into all aspects of life. It is a kingdom of priests, dispersed among all the nations, led by elders who are trained and equipped to train and equip. The heavenly Jerusalem is said to specifically have no temple, and that it lacks mediating functions of temples. The heavenly Jerusalem is God's palace, is God's kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven.